Well, the time is finally here to take a look back at the last entry into the Spider-Man Beanox saga, The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Ugh. From porting over the Treyarch games onto PC all the way into their own fully fledged developed titles, the history that Beanox has had with Spider-Man games is quite rich when one really comes to take a look at it. And even though at this point most of their games range from mediocre to decent, especially in contrast to the absolute masterpieces in licensed gaming by way of the Arkham series, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 had all the makings in the world to finally be that one true Beanox Spider-Man game you felt that they were eventually building to. This game was supposed to be that crescendo. With a prolonged development time of over 2 years and a pretty decent foundation to build upon from the first Amazing Spider-Man game, this was supposed to be that Spider-Man game that finally pulled that character out of the trenches that Spider-Man 3 dug him in, and every subsequent release further shoved him down. Unfortunately, we all know how that turned out. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is regarded by the community as one of the worst Spider-Man games of all time, being almost unanimously hated for just how underwhelming and poorly developed it was when expectations were set so high to begin with. The pure vitriol this game garners with Spider-Man fans has been well documented across the board, and no one was more critical about the game prior to its release than me. I sniffed the bullshit meter a mile away, and given how much of the Amazing Spider-Man 1 I had played, I knew when things were being reused, and I wasn't afraid to call it out, especially when things were being stripped from the first game, and then being re-added as if they were legitimate upgrades and new features like the dumpster throw from the Amazing Spider-Man 1, which was something you could do from the get-go in that game. And given Activision's track record with Spider-Man games and pretty much all of their published titles at that point, the less money actually being pumped into their game in terms of budget, and the more assets that they could reuse from their games prior, the better, as it would lead into less development expenses and more money garnered by sales overall. If it isn't clear enough, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is nothing short of a cash grab, a game made specifically to capitalize on the hype of the film and not much else. But you guys know this. You're well aware of this factoid. There's nothing new being mentioned here. That's not why you're here. You're here for the analytical look a hack like me brings to the table. Are you guys really gonna make me play this game? I haven't touched it since 2014, and quite frankly, I really don't want to, because this game just brings back some bad memories, and you're gonna make me play this, aren't you? Ah, shit. Well, let's dive into the plot. Prior to this game's release, Beanox claimed that this game would not be your traditional movie tie-in game and would instead feature its own story with overlapping story beats from the film. So, basically a movie tie-in game. Okay. They also claimed that there would be no spoilers from the film making its way onto the game unlike in the first game, but that too is a lie as we find out many of the things we would have in the film in this game, but I digress. We start off with Uncle Ben getting shot.
No! I am Confucian.
Anyway, the entire reason this whole thing plays out is to once again remind us about Dennis Carradine, Uncle Ben's murderer, who Peter is still actively trying to pursue in order to bring him to justice. This harkens back to the first film where Peter had a damn near obsession with finding this guy for the first third of that movie. He gets some info from our good old pal Herman after a weapons deal gone south, who's not quite shocking just yet via some poorly implemented and pace-breaking conversation choices that were clearly only stuck in here for trendy reasons because Mass Effect and Deus Ex Human Revolution did it so well. But it adds no real substance or value to this game whatsoever. He then gets away because, of course, if Herman Schultz is in this game, he's gotta be the Shocker! But on a more serious note, how many times is it with this character? Let's detour a bit and count how many times we see Shocker in Spider-Man video games. Spider-Man 2, Enter Electro. Spider-Man the movie game. Spider-Man 2 the movie game. Ultimate Spider-Man. This game. Spider-Man PS4. Enough! That's not even counting the 8-bit or 16-bit era games. Give the character a break for crying out loud. Give us another villain. Anyway, back to the plot. Spider-Man ends up tracking down Carradine, but in his efforts to apprehend him, he darts off and grabs a hostage via a carjacking, and while Spidey swoops in to save the day, he has still yet to confront his uncle's killer who's still getting away in the carjacked vehicle. When he finally catches up to it, the vehicle is completely totaled and wiped out, and his attempts to follow up on the crash are met with the body of Dennis Carradine. More realistically, an arm and a couple of trash bags, but yeah. We then see the letters CK written on the wall in blood. I'm surprised the Bloods didn't sue Beanox or Marvel for gimmick infringement here. After this, Aunt May and Peter have a heart-to-heart about Carradine's death and how they're feeling about it. And while both are glad the man is gone and can't hurt anybody else, they understand the how of this situation was completely wrong. And then, of course, because moments in this game are never allowed to sink in, there's a raid on Oscorp as the Russians and Shocker's goons are both invading for more advanced gear in their escalating gang war for the most arbitrary of reasons. You take out the Russians and Shocker's goons, and then the human pincushion himself. According to Schultz himself, the reason these guys are loading up and feuding is because of a lone serial killer who goes by the name of the Carnage Killer. That's right, the dude who took out Carradine. That's a pretty subtle name for the identity of this guy, to be honest. I mean, of course, if you spell subtlety like this.
FBI, open up!
There's gonna be carnage.
Oh, and by the way, while you're stopping these guys in Oscorp, you're also ham-fisted your introduction to Max Dillon. It's almost as equally egregious as his character arc in the actual film, but I think it's actually even worse here. You at least get to see his transformation in the film, however stupid his descent into villainy is, while here, in this game, you see him twice. This is the first time, and I'll let you take a wild guess on his second encounter. Oh, and by the way, there's no Gwen Stacy in this game. Odd, considering that she was a very important character in the first one. She's mentioned in passing once, but it's made pretty clear that in between this game and the last, the two split up, and that's all the explanation we get in this game, because clearly we have to avoid this. Anyway, after the raid on Oscorp, Norman Osborn dies. It's that abrupt. Following suit, Harry Osborn takes over the day-to-day at Oscorp, and due to the fallout with all the craziness from the cross-species, the giant robots, now the raid on Oscorp, and the ensuing gang war, Oscorp desperately needs a positive, and Harry has partnered with Wilson Fisk to— Good God, what the hell is wrong with Fisk? He's like 12 feet tall and 1,000 pounds. I think he even eclipses the Hulk. Well, we might as well address the elephant in the room with these models. They are horrendous in every shape of the word.
Look! Look!
This is the PS4, and these models look like they're PS2. Some of these models are just anatomically incorrect and wildly disproportionate, and I get it, it's a creative liberty, but good lord. And I mentioned this in the last review, but could you not have made Peter look at least somewhat human and not like he's had a million botched plastic surgery jobs? Well, moving on. Fisk and Osborn create a new task force designed to help what's dubbed the crime wave dissipate. Of course, Fisk has ulterior motives as he seeks to take complete control over Oscorp from Harry, who denies the request and even knows that Fisk isn't the most ideal partner, but he is the only one willing to fund this task force, but is told that Fisk will wait until he dies from the disease that killed his father. That's some pretty privy information you got there, Fisk. I wonder how you got it. Afterward, there's another gang-related incident in Central Park that Spider-Man has to take care of, and in his efforts, he's greeted by Kraven, using a calling card very similar to his own. Kraven is offering to help Spider-Man and become his mentor to help stop the crime wave and capture the Carnage Killer. And while Peter has his suspicions about Kraven, after talking to him as Peter Parker and getting more info out of him, and finding that he wiped out all of the cross-species from the last game, he ultimately acquiesces and accepts his help. This is actually a pretty damn good premise and an interesting plot thread that unfortunately had the misfortune of being put into a game with very little care for its story. With the right build and setup, this could have been awesome, but as most things with this game tend to go, it was underdeveloped and just over before you know it. Anyway, Kraven teaches Spider-Man to hunt for the big fish, so to speak, to allow the smaller criminals to lead him to the big ones for more efficient takedowns. This all seems like pretty common knowledge stuff, but what do I know, I guess. I think it would have been more interesting if Kraven would have shown him more ways to use his elements for stealth attacks or something, you know, something actually hunting related, but I guess that's too creative, especially for this game. Spider-Man under the tutelage of Kraven comes across an underground hideout, which also serves as the game's way of giving you costumes per completion, as well as testing your stealth skills. Again, if they did anything stealth related with Kraven, this would have tied in beautifully. You find out that the Russian mob actually has plans set in motion to assassinate Wilson Fisk at his anti-crime fundraiser, and of course you as Spider-Man cannot allow that to happen, but you can't just show up as Spider-Man, so you have to do some sleuthing, via your other job as pretend journalist but actually photographer for the Daily Bugle. So Jameson does exist in this universe. Where the hell was he last time? He gets the in via Whitney Chang, who is clearly not voiced by Claudia Black this time around and has no real relevancy in this game outside of this brief cameo. And yet she is still my most disliked character in this game, but we'll get there. Trust me, we'll get there. It's at this fundraiser where you finally meet Harry Osborn face to face for the first time in over 10 years. That's kind of awkward. After a bunch of nonsensical exposition from Harry and some pretty awful graphical issues, Peter goes into action as his spider sense goes off and thwarts the assassination attempt. After this is a bunch of stuff related to the Carnage Killer and the Russian mob who kidnap a random civilian believing him to be the killer, but apparently it's not after some really shoddy convincing job by the civilian. Jeez, don't let Spider-Man ever be a cop. Ever. After this, Spidey gets a positive ID on the Carnage Killer and with Kraven's help manages to track down Cletus Cassidy and take him out. After this, we get a long, boring speech about why he did what he did, citing that he was doing what Spider-Man couldn't but secretly wanted to, and this entire plot is contrived. I've been holding off saying that for the longest time, but that is the number one word to explain everything in this damn story. Contrived. There is no evidence anywhere at all in this entire plot that shows that this is something even remotely close to what Spider-Man wanted to do to anyone, even Carradine. This entire thread is stupid and makes no sense, and it makes the following with Kraven even more so, as he's disappointed that Spidey wouldn't unleash his killer instinct and kill Cletus. Why would he? What would lead you to believe he would do that? This game makes no attempt to even remotely show Spider-Man even teetering toward that line, making this sudden shift so out of left field that Derek Jeter is still flying into the stands at Yankee Stadium trying to catch it. You know what would have worked and made a little bit more sense? Symbiote Spidey giving into the suit, coming close to actually killing Cletus, being fueled by the anger the suit permeates, while also being egged on by Kraven, being pissed that Cletus took his one chance of closure away by killing Carradine, and all that pain, that frustration, and that sorrow being unleashed was a direct result of that until he realizes in that moment what he's becoming, what he's actually doing, becoming exactly what took his uncle away from him, a killer. He then rejects Kraven. He lets go of Cassidy instead of following through and killing him. This would have been infinitely better and less contrived, and it also would have made a hell of a lot more sense, since we know we are getting Carnage because Cletus Cassidy is in this game, and that character cannot exist without Venom, but more importantly, Venom and Carnage cannot exist without Spider-Man! But this is the situation at hand, and therefore we have to deal with things just happening and making no sense because whatever. It's frustrating because there are elements of a good story here somewhere, but they're just completely mishandled. And whether or not it's due to the red tape from Sony or Marvel or just Beanox not really understanding the character is unknown. But once again, I digress. With Cassidy being taken off to Ravencroft to be experimented by Donald Mencken, Harry's right-hand man of sorts at Oscorp, and the Russian mob and Schultz's men all gone, Fisk is now preparing to move in and take control of the power vacuum. But suddenly, Black Hat. She gets a reboot of sorts in this game because Felicia Hardy in the last game was a fucking psycho who held hostages at gunpoint. Now she's more in line with how she normally behaves. Mischievous and flirtatious, and, a cat burglar. She lures Spider-Man into a museum under the guise of a robbery being conducted by her, but it's all a ruse. She really wants to just screw with Spider-Man, and the only purpose this honestly serves is to once again spout some more exposition about how Fisk had her experimented on in Ravencroft, which is just arbitrary reason number 5 million for things in this plot just happening that are entirely contrived. So again, another character that's just seemingly thrown in for not much else other than fan service with no real substance. But hey, at least they got her right this time. Yay? Peter, now with this information, goes straight to Harry Osborn to try and collect some more information on Fisk. It's here where it's revealed that Fisk paid Kraven to be a security consultant of sorts to the task force, and that Harry is also dying, and he believes that he needs Spider-Man's blood in order to survive, and he begs Peter to pretty much help him out there. Which of course Spider-Man refuses due to the complications on what could potentially happen to his friend, given the cross-species stuff. Peter, feeling betrayed and also conflicted at Harry's situation, now moves forward to confront Kraven at his now abandoned loft, who springs a trap, and yeah, the two fight and Spider-Man beats him in a rather simplistic boss fight in Central Park. He then sneaks on a supply truck heading toward Fisk's hideout and infiltrates it. Spidey tries to pin down evidence on Fisk that'll stick to incriminate him after giving him a smackdown, with some of the worst fat jokes I've ever heard and some equally bad mocap, which has been questionable all game, but is made even worse here. What even is this? Why is Spider-Man moving around like he's Phil Lamar's UBS guy from the Mad TV skits?
We just had the office painted.
Looks good.
He's not even saying anything at this point, and he's still moving around like he's on drugs. How did nobody catch this and edit this out? In Fisk's defeat, he deflects any of the blame being shifted on him by way of various proxies he uses to scapegoat his way out of being incriminated, but Spider-Man attempts to hack into Fisk's computer in order to find evidence that'll stick when suddenly, a power surge. And you all know what's coming next. It's Electro time now, and he's attacking people for no sustainable reason whatsoever other than, well, we contractually have to do this, so throw him in, fuck it, why not? Spider-Man defeats Electro in a pretty meh boss fight, but it's definitely the one with the most spectacle in the game, so I'll give them that. And then suddenly, Green Goblin. And then after that, Carnage at Ravencroft, which admittedly had more of a build than Electro or the Goblin, but still. Holy shit, this game went off the rails after Fisk. Once you defeat Carnage and after the credits, you get a post-credits scene featuring Fisk and a surprise twist ending revealing Donald Benken, who was Norman Osborn's right-hand man and by default Harry after his death, to be none other than the Chameleon, and a guy who was feeding Fisk information the entire time being the mole at Oscorp. This was a damn good twist and an interesting proposition that the game gives, and it's so nice to see someone like Chameleon get the spotlight here because he's a villain that we never see in Spider-Man games ever. As a matter of fact, I think this is the first one. While the rest of the story was trash, this was exciting stuff, but it never came to bear fruit because the movie was poorly received and, well, we know what happened next. Marvel reacquired their licenses from Activision and we had arguably the best Spider-Man game ever to exist. But this story, man, you talk about awful Spider-Man stories. I'm not quite sure if this game or the movie it's based on were trying to compete for worst Spider-Man narrative in a Spider-Man related anything ever, but yeah, they're pretty neck and neck. From its bland, nothing really happening plot to its egregious use of villains and motives, this game's plot is an absolute chore to get through. And even though its length is technically one mission longer than the first Amazing Spider-Man game, totaling out at 14, it still feels significantly shorter than the last game. But the most frustrating thing about this game's plot is that there are genuinely good plot threads in here that with enough care and exploration, and most importantly time to let properly develop organically, could have been amazing, but were ultimately squandered for what feels like time, resource, and budgetary reasons. It's because of all of this, on top of most of the good character-specific writing that we got in the last game going right out the window and crashing harshly on the ground, that the first feelings of this series having some serious regression problems start rearing its ugly head. The rest of the game unfortunately doesn't help quell that feeling either. In a lot of ways, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 actively takes steps backwards, and while there are some improvements, the rest of the game either plays it too safe, or it actually takes things away from you that you could have done in the previous game under the guise of it being new upgrades. Quite frankly, if you played The Amazing Spider-Man 1, everything about this game minus the graphical facelift the city gets is an insult. Let's start off with web swinging. Arguably the most important pillar in any Spider-Man game, web swinging in The Amazing Spider-Man 1 was pretty janky as there was no real momentum-based physics attached to it, and was more aligned with a canned animation with various predetermined points of release in which if you reached a certain point you detach. It's not a bad system, as Spider-Man PS4 also kind of utilizes this system to an extent, but you were never really in control of any of your swings, but rather the direction that you were going in or wanted to go. And nothing proved that more than changing directions in mid-swing. But the most frustrating thing about it was just how poor it was in comparison to games prior. The sense of speed and the thrill of swinging were taken away. Camera positioning was way too close, and swinging off of clouds, which was a retired concept that died off with the first Spider-Man movie game, was brought back for some mind-boggling reason. All of these things combined made for some less than stellar mobility for a character whose trademark is mobility. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 boasted that Spider-Man will no longer be swinging from the sky and that a new mechanic would be put into the game to kind of give a new spin on the swinging system. The mechanic, you might ask? Making L2 control your left-handed swings and R2 in control of your right-handed swings. Oh boy. This mechanic, while I think I understand the intentions behind it, is not good. Its execution is pretty flawed, but my guess from the logic behind it is to allow players to chain web lines for a more satisfying swing, seamlessly going from left-handed to right. The problem is, it doesn't feel good. Web swinging in this game, while improved from the last one due to a more retracted camera and a boost feature which you unlock, is still the same janky swinging from the last game with a smidge more polish put into it. No longer do you go from 0 to 100 in a second when you try to change directions, and you actually can stop to do a web yo-yo, which in the last game you couldn't even do, despite the fact that the action is in the game. Honestly, it's hard to talk about control in a game like this, but the main reason I dislike the web swinging in this game, even more so than the first Amazing Spider-Man, is control. It just feels very start and stop, and I can't really put a pinpoint explanation as to why that is, but you can just take a look at it and come to the conclusion for yourself. The left-handed to right-handed sequences are not seamless, they're interrupted, and because of it, it just looks janky. Everything about web swinging feels like it's on rails, like all you have to do is hit the corresponding buttons and you'll immediately be taken to where you need to as long as your camera's in the right place. It's all very controlled, very low effort, very low skill, and it doesn't allow me to express myself as freely and naturally as other games before have allowed me to do so. And in the last review, I mentioned rumble feedback on the controller helping to make things feel satisfying. And while I'm unsure how the PS3, 360, and Xbox One versions fared out, on the PS4 you barely get any feedback on the DualShock in almost anything you do with this game, contributing to this overall feeling of emptiness with every action that you take. Rumble features might seem like a small thing, but they can help make or break immersion experiences, and again, Amazing Spider-Man 1 knocked this out of the park, so it's really shocking that this game didn't even remotely come close to replicating that. On top of that, Beanox lied to us again. Your webs don't actually attach to buildings, they attach to the air. Again. Don't get me wrong, sometimes you can actually visibly see a web line on a building, but the majority of the time you're probably swinging on air. If they were more honest and said that they put a height cap as to where your web line is attached to coincide with the city grid, that would have been nice, but because they didn't, it makes it extremely jarring to hear a dev say something for the game to actively show you otherwise. It's because of this that a lot of the frustration with web swinging comes in place. Sometimes you could be right next to a building, but for whatever reason, Spider-Man refuses to shoot out a web line. Other times you're not even that close, but you magically grab onto something? It's inconsistent as hell. And the worst part about it is how it functions when in translation with other mobility-based actions, more specifically wall running. Good luck trying not to lose your lunch as you transition out from a wall run into web swinging. The sudden jolt of the camera changing perspectives almost always throws me off and confuses the hell out of me in my positioning. It's almost like these things were developed but no one took time to realize how they should all flow together so it doesn't get in each other's way, and instead threw them all at the wall hoping that they would stick. Funnily enough, web rush is what ends up getting the most improvement in this game. It functions exactly the same as it did in the last game, allowing for a slowing of time for proper platform positioning for Spider-Man, for holding the button down, as well as something as an auto parkour system for merely tapping the button. This time around though, all the actions taken to get you from your destination of choice makes sense, and it doesn't look as weird or as janky as it did in the first game. So props for this getting at the very least cleaned up and more refined, as web rush as a concept wasn't an absolute terrible idea. Having two buttons be dedicated to a single action by way of web swinging just seems really gimmicky to me, to be honest, and it also hampers the game as the button could have been used for something else like precision targeting or perhaps the seismic blast, which is a new gadget that we'll cover in combat, but instead what we get is some extremely stiff and awkward web swinging. Combat is also identical to how it was in The Amazing Spider-Man 1. Virtually no real substantial changes were made outside of now being able to counter multiple hits in one go. Outside of that, everything from animations to takedowns to the same systems being in place to nearly the same enemy types, and the same upgrades, albeit very neuter this time around, is here with no real changes or additions being made. And look, it's not a bad thing to reuse assets if it worked in the game prior. Hell, the Arkham series has had the same animation since Asylum, but with every iteration of that game, they add new things to help propel the system forward and improve upon it. And as said earlier, there was a lot more taken out in this game than added in. But one of the most frustrating things about this combat system is something that infuriates me to no end and is the only game with a system like this to have this happen to you. Occasionally, a bad guy is going to try and strike you only for you to counter his attack. This is pretty standard stuff, you guys know this. But more than likely, when you get into your battle dance in combat and you really start to flow, when a guy is going to hit you, you're probably going to take a swing at that guy to try to hit him before he hits you to stop his incoming attack, and not kill your flow. Arkham does this, even the first Amazing Spider-Man game does this, but in this game, they tank your hits and they hit you, regardless of contact being made first on your end, forcing a counter to be the one and only method of getting out of this jam. This is so stupid, and it makes combat less interesting as it's limiting engagements and how you approach them, while also frustrating you when you clearly made contact first. Now, you're just hitting people and waiting for your spider sense to go off to counter, as there's no other way around it outside of disengaging from the fight. Why would you want to do that? You're already in combat. Commit to it. Furthermore, and say it with me for the fourth time now, webbing is once again absolutely useless in this game. It's primarily used for gimmicks involving the new enemy types and not much else. You have speedies and task force glider troopers, which are just thugs that move faster and are hittable normally, and need to be pulled in with web pulls, which are a new addition, but are really just used for these enemies in order to land hits. Brutes, which need to be stunned with seismic blasts, which you steal from Shocker, and task force armored goons who you need to disable their armor by shooting ionic webbing at it in order to be more effective against them. Gone are things like web throws, now replaced with seismic blasts, which is done by holding down the webbing button, so any real versatility this game might have had with webbing is officially hampered by the implementation of the new things in this game. It also doesn't help that the mainline strategy in this game stays the same no matter what. It's either pull, disarm, or stun, and there's no real variety even with the new enemy types, and when you're going through the story, it definitely shows. I played this game on the hardest difficulty, and it was quite honestly a breeze, and it's shocking that the game once again takes away enemy types, as the shields from the last game are also missing. If this already doesn't set the bells off, the upgrades menu will. This game has absolutely, positively no depth to it whatsoever. And I theorize that the reason for this is due to the fact that The Amazing Spider-Man 1 had so many things in that game that made things insanely easy. The dumpster throw, for example, is an unlock in this game versus in the first game where it was just a normal move that you could do from the start of the game. But it's such an overpowered move because its area of effect practically covers the entire room you're in, making it an easy cleanup afterward. Instead of properly balancing it, tightening the AoE of the attack, they just reused it, didn't modify it, and made it an upgrade. This is lazy as fuck! Especially since compared to the last game, there's a lot less throwables in this game by comparison, so why would you make this an unlock? Take a game like Deus Ex Human Revolution, for example. That's a game in which throughout the course of it you spend hours unlocking every possible augmentation you can to further bolster Adam Jensen. And in the very next game, literally at the start of the very next game in that series, you have everything you spend time on in the last game at your disposal, with a lot of new things now added on top of that. This is how sequels are supposed to work. So why do we have the same webbing upgrades from the last game? Why do we have dumpster throws as an unlockable, or the web rush combo? It's almost as if they couldn't figure out how to give combat depth and make it challenging without gutting it and starting from scratch. Like they realized, okay, we made combat a little too easy, and a lot of the stuff we implemented was very automated and resulted in quick enemy dispatching in the last game. How do we fine-tune that here? And they were so creatively bankrupt that the only idea they had was making a vast majority of them late-game unlockables in the upgrades tab, or just flat-out omitted from the game. And you can tell that they were either short on time or ideas because even the new stuff like ionic webbing and seismic blasts have upgrades that only affect their overall usefulness in terms of either how fast they can be used or how effective they are against enemies, and nothing else more than that. It's all just so flat and uninspired, and if their goal was to make the game a little bit more difficult, they ultimately failed, as one could say it's a hell of a lot more easier than the last game just due to the nature of how formulaic everything is. And this even extends to boss fights, which are literally repeated sequences over and over again, with no strategy change whatsoever. The only time the game truly gets challenging, it's when its own mechanics hamper you in combat. This game has a really hard time trying to keep track of what enemy you're trying to hit with what, which leads to some really frustrating experiences when you're trying to seismic blast a brute, but the damned auto-targeting tracks a guy slightly to the right or left of you, regardless of how much you thought you centered the camera on the guy you actually wanted to hit. Or, if you play the coin-op arcade machine in Stan's comic book shop, which offers a challenge mode via enemy waves that you need to defeat without getting hit a certain amount of times. This is a pretty neat concept and a natural evolution from Edge of Time's arena mode, just without the bugs. Definitely a diamond in the rough, and we'll cover this shop a little bit more when we talk about extras. Stuff in this game is overall mostly improved. There are some new animations for contextual takedowns, which I actually do like, and I'm glad that at the very least this game corrected the cheap auto bailout button from the last game whenever you got caught and took it out in this one. But what I'm not a fan of is, again, taking things out for no real reason. You can no longer do stealth attacks from the ceiling, you now have to close in the gap by rappelling down, and honestly, that's fine. It adds a little bit more of a risk to stealth gameplay, but why did they get rid of dual takedowns? One of the very first stealth encounters you have in this game is the raid on Oscorp, and immediately when you're set in the room with the hostages, you're presented with two guards that are right next to each other. I vividly remember coming off the Amazing Spider-Man 1 when I first got this game and jumping into this game thinking I could take both of these guys out in one go, when to my surprise you only grab one and the other one just starts unloading on you. And then of course, once you start progressing through the game and you figure out that most of the unlocks are repeats of the Amazing Spider-Man 1s, you think to yourself, okay, maybe dual stealth takedowns are an upgradable unlock perhaps categorized in the web pull tab. That would make sense, but it's not. There are virtually no upgrades to anything stealth related whatsoever. The only upgrades, if you can call them that, are suit-specific mods that have stealth attributes tied to them, and even then, it doesn't really do much but give you more efficiency, which is just a fancy way of saying that you don't get detected as fast, and takedown range. The good thing about suit mods at the very least is that XP gained by using said suits by completing missions and other various things around the game end up building more levels for that specific suit, and the higher the level the better the stats, capping you out at a level 8. This is a pretty cool feature, but my problem with it is that it sets stats for specific suits. You can't mix and match attributes. What the suit has is what the suit will stay with, and if you don't like playing with certain suits but do like the attributes they come with, well, unfortunately, you're out of luck. There's also something else that this game has that affects attributes, but we'll get to that mechanic very shortly. Suits, as mentioned earlier, are unlockable via Russian hideouts that are basically the game's answer to the Predator missions from the Arkham series. They're fun, but short little stealth exercises that can often be showcases of both the best and the worst this game has to offer, with unique animations and a little bit of strategy, and tightly knit spaces and an absolute batshit camera. The suits in this game are plentiful, but quite frankly are recycled suits from the last couple of games. Equally disappointing is suit damage, which is very heavily reduced from the last game. It takes way more punishment to see the suit start to tear. There are 4 new additions, which are Spider Carnage, Ricochet, and the Superior Spider-Man suit. All unique suits which I'm happy to see in this game, but we also have our standard fare of Beanock's favorites, including 2099, again, Flipside, again, Noir, again, Symbiote, again, Iron Spider, again, and the list goes on. Now, truth be told, I am a little bit bummed at this suit choice selection, just because we get these choices in every Beanock's game. And I get it, they're callbacks to their past work, but there's so many more suit choice selections that repeating the same ones over and over again gets old. Variety is key here, and when a majority of your suits comprise of the same selection of suits that we've seen in all 3 of the games you've developed so far, people are going to turn on you because it feels lazy. It also doesn't help that the rest of the game exemplifies this. Why not bring back Spider Armor from Shattered Dimensions, or Spider Clan, or even Spider-Man vs. Wolverine from Edge of Time? Why not take inspiration from the comics, and do a McFarlane-styled Spider-Man with huge eyes, complete with comic book shading similar to how Shattered Dimensions did? These are all things that I questioned then, and still do now. And it does look like there was going to be an attempt to bring back the Raimi suit for this game, as there is an incredibly poor textured version of the Spider-Man 3 symbiote suit in Stan's store, but that suit never made its way. Still though, the selection is way more than the last game, so there's that at least. Speaking of Stan's store, it's probably time we talk about extras. The game retains the same stuff as the last one, audio logs and comic books scattered around the city which are bundled in sets that once finished, unlock a readable comic book, which again, I love this. I wish more comic book games would do this, quite honestly. The comic book shop has a lot of little Easter eggs all over the place, which is quite neat, as well as figures of the horrendous models in the game, which, the less said the better, quite honestly. I don't think I need to drive that nail home any more than I already have. There's also some concept art that looks pretty good. Wish the rest of the game looked as good, to be quite honest. We also get Stan Lee thirsting over Black Cat and the arcade machine, which once again serves as a challenge mode for those looking to actually be challenged by this game. It's nice to hear Stan Lee in this game. He's a bright spot in a game lacking any of them. I guess I should talk about the voice acting since we're talking about Stan here. It's fine. Sam Riegel returns as Spider-Man and he's fine. Steve Bloom is also back, but this time he's Kraven and he's fine. JB Blank is Wilson Fisk, and I guess he's the closest thing to being a standout performance in this game, as he sounds like he's one cheeseburger away from passing out. Kevin Dorman is Harry Osborn, and he sounds pretty awfully disinterested at times, but when he's the Goblin Doubt, he's eccentric as all hell, so talk about Jekyll and Hyde. The rest of the sounds are generic. Music is entirely forgettable outside of the tribute to James Horner's score from the first film, being honored in this game in the loading screen, which you will hear quite often, I might add. But the game has awful audio mixing at times. This one scene with Harry and Spider-Man has them overlapping in sentences, and at a certain point you'd expect one of them to stop talking as the other one cuts them off, but they keep going, almost as if they couldn't be bothered to properly edit this. And in the Fisk boss fight, the in-game music is so damn loud it drowns out the dialogue, which is just a true staple of bad video games. The NPCs are horrendous in this game. While not quite Spider-Man 2 levels of bad, their delivery is mostly questionable, especially when you combine them with these janky as hell animations, given the situations these characters are supposedly in.
Holy cow! That's a bomb!
Alright, I think I've avoided talking about this subject for long enough. Let's not beat around the bush. Let's talk about the city and its wonderful offerings. This game has a wildly improved Manhattan in comparison to the last game. As far as I can tell, repeated geography is no longer an issue here, and it does look half decent. I mean, Oscorp actually kind of looks like how it does in the film. But as a whole, the city is not exactly great. While this New York is a lot more detailed than the last one, it's also extraordinarily dead. New York City is a pretty lively place with a lot happening at any given time. Parties, music being blasted from bodegas all over the place, people trying to sell you pretzels or hot dogs or roasted peanuts, people coming in and off of subways, lots of storefronts, people on roofs just chilling out. I mean, there's always something going on at any given time there. But in this game, people just walk around and drive. That's about it. There's civilian chatter here and there, which is nice, but again, that's about it. Texture popping is also really bad here. And while that's not something I normally mention all the time, in this game it is so bad. Objects that are about 40 meters out usually just appear or disappear out of thin air. And this was something that I mentioned prior to this game releasing, way before this game came out. And even in the final build, it's still an issue. Just look at this. I'm not even swinging, and yet this traffic light and the signs on this post just appear and disappear. And it doesn't happen with just signs and posts. It happens with trees and street textures as well. Mind you, this is on the PS4, and games have proven that they can very damn well handle the pretty extensive draw distances this system is capable of producing. So what the hell happened here? Furthermore, time of day in this game is pretty shoddy to say the least. During the story, time of day switches depending on what mission is tailored to, and that's okay. But in The Amazing Spider-Man 1, once you beat the game, you were allowed to swap to whatever point of day you desired. In The Amazing Spider-Man 2, there's no choice. It's entirely random. And I'm not sure why, again, this was something taken out in this game that the last one had. It makes zero sense to go from sunset to daytime, but that is exactly what happens here. There's races that can be done which are just extremely easy and don't require any effort outside of just tapping R1. And there's photo missions which return, but they don't add much. But what about the crimes? Well, crimes return in the open world, and they're actually around for the entirety of the game this time around. They don't stop happening once you've done a set number of them, which is nice. And while most crimes are returning from The Amazing Spider-Man 1, we do get some new stuff in here, like these burning building scenarios, which I hope you like the color blue, because you're going to be seeing it quite a lot. The crimes, while reoccurring, are not randomly generated, however. After a certain amount of them being done, you will start to see them repeat in the same exact spots, with the same exact scenarios, with the same exact civilians, every single time, which is kind of disappointing. But while we went from one end of the extreme to not having reoccurring crimes to the other, it would not be fitting for this game to take one step forward and a million steps back. Doing these crimes are met with countless useless and annoying mini loading screens, and I've avoided talking about the damn loading screens in my plot coverage because I was saving it for this portion of the review. Remember how I said Whitney Chang was my least favorite character in this game? This is the reason why. Every time you do a crime, you have to hear this goddamn news bulletin every single time. It's a load screen. It's being used to despawn assets, which, hey, I get it. A game needs to do this to save on memory and whatnot. But The Amazing Spider-Man 1 would only cut to black if you were in the same area where the crime finished. If you were to retain in the same area after you finished a crime, it would cut to a loading screen. If you got out of there, it would not. So why the fuck are we not allowed that here? Why does it not happen here? Why does it not happen? Why not just have a little icon pop up in one of the corners while you're swinging away with the same news bulletin within the confines of the actual game world instead of giving us this damn loading screen? The lack of options in this is more frustrating, as doing these damn crimes to be met with this intrusive loading screen just seems completely unnecessary, and it only makes it so that you don't want to do crimes altogether. You want to avoid them. And this is intensified with just how many loading screens there are in this game already. Certain levels have loading screens to get into them, and then another load screen within the same section of the same level, and then another loading screen to get out of it. What the hell is the point of this? Meanwhile, we have games like Max Payne 3, which seamlessly blend cinematics and gameplay without intrusive-ass loading screen cuts within loading screen cuts within loading screen cuts. And that game came out in 2012. And you know what? Granted, not every game is going to be able to do this, I understand. But the amount of loading that this game does is absolutely nuts that, again, we are on PlayStation 4. A system more than capable of handling this dumpster fire of a game, and then some. But here is the biggest problem. The coup de grace that turned this game from a terrible sequel to an absolute unplayable nightmare. The Hero and Menace system. This mechanic, oh boy, this mechanic can squarely fuck right off! Somewhere along the lines, Beanox got the idea of implementing something of a morality system into this game, and while this wouldn't be the first Spider-Man game to implement said idea, it was an interesting addition at first because everyone remembers Web of Shadows, and the system sounded very familiar to what that game did. And say what you want about Web of Shadows, but that mechanic added a ton of replay value to that game. So how does it work in this game? Allow me to show you a visual representation. I'm looking for Spider-Man.
Spider-Man? There's no crimes here.
This mechanic sucks. It is tied directly to crimes, and it forces players to do said crimes at any given time in the open world, no matter what it is that they are doing. If you choose to neglect said crimes, your menace meter goes up, And if you let it scale up to level 3, the task force rains hellfire and brimstone all over your ass and won't let you breathe until you start taking care of crimes. But JC, that doesn't sound too bad. As long as you take care of the meter, you have time to do whatever you want.
Oh, really? Fool!
Here is where you are wrong. Crimes in this game are on timers, and usually when they start to expire, they do so in duos, meaning that one of these crimes are probably going to go by the wayside and negatively impact your meter, which means if you are lucky enough to get to the other one in time, the effect of doing that crime is practically null and voided because whatever you gained won't be enough to offset the loss from the other crime that you couldn't reach in time, and this wouldn't be such a problem if the crimes set to expire were anywhere near you, but they never are. They're usually halfway across the map. Couple that with the fact that every time you do these damned crimes, you have to be greeted with an annoying as fuck Daily Bugle loading screen. But the kicker is that even if you start a crime before any of them expire, you would think that it would theoretically stop the rest of the crimes off of their timers, but it doesn't. It still continues in real time. So when you're coming off of one, there's 2 more immediately expiring, and the one that you had hoped to do coming off of the one you just did is expired, hurting your meter. You absolutely cannot win with this system. Well, JC, I don't mind having to fight the task force guys if they come after me. I'll just deal with it. So you'll also deal with the non-stop barrages of drones, wall-mounted turrets, and force fields that disable your web shooters that don't even allow you to get away. I mean, I just can't. I can't
do it. Fuck it. Go. I can't do it. Fuck it. Go. I can't do it. Fuck it. Go. I can't do it. Thanks again for watching. Fuck it.
There's no other way to shape this. This is not fun. I can't believe no one caught this in testing and thought to themselves, holy shit, we fucked this up. We should probably adjust this. Especially since this game actually had a patch, the lone one it would ever see, and you would think that they would actually have fixed some things in this game. But no, it's still a buggy, unfun mess. Say you're somebody who only casually wants to do crimes around the city and collect comic books so you can read them in Stan's store. Well, good luck doing that without the task force constantly up your ass probing you 5 ways to Sunday. What makes this even more frustrating is that this issue could have easily been remedied with things and systems that are already in set place within the game. Remember the useless conversation bits I mentioned earlier? Those could have been used as an RPG-style choice selection system, which depending on how you choose could influence your hero or menace meter. That way, interactions you have later on in the game, like the awfully contrived Craven and Cassidy moment, make more sense if you're leaning toward one side more than the other or even in between. This makes way more sense and eliminates the stress of having to continuously do crimes on repeat in order to satisfy the damned meter. And that's not to say that crimes couldn't potentially influence the meter one way or another, but eliminating the fucking timer and the fact that it doesn't even let you properly traverse the city, which is one of the most important things in any Spider-Man game, would have been a major improvement. And it also would have helped to add replay value to a game that already feels entirely shallow. Web of Shadows did this and proved that even though they did stuff in that game that was absolutely batshit, it works. But why would this game do anything creative? It's all about the money. Fuck it. If it's broken, ship it out the door. The kiddies will buy it. It's Spider-Man. I have had enough talking about this dreadful game. I try, for the most part, to stay objective during these reviews, and I try to look for positives if I can find them and bring them to light, and highlight the bad in the game if I have to. But this game broke me. I distinctly remember how within the first hour of having played this game when I first got it, how disappointed I was, how underwhelmed and frustrated that after all that time, this was the end product. How a game could gut itself in its supposed sequel missing more things than its predecessor had to offer. How a Spider-Man game could actively hate the player for attempting to play the game, asinine design choices, poorly implemented mechanics. I even told my brother at the time that the value I got out of paying $60 for this game was the free movie tickets that came with the purchase. I paid $60 for fucking movie tickets. I wanted so badly for this to be the game that finally dug Spider-Man out of the trenches and gave us something memorable. I wanted this to be the good Beanox game that they were seemingly getting around to with every release. But instead, what we got was another run-of-the-mill, factory-assembled, careless cash grab with no care, no effort put into it whatsoever, designed solely to sell due to its association with the film and not because it had any legs of its own to stand on. The only positive to come out of this were the few good concepts and ideas that Beanox had that Insomniac would ultimately end up use and remodel in much more thoughtful and careful ways, as when you line things up you can actually see some of the DNA from this game in Marvel's Spider-Man. When I say this game broke me, that is no exaggeration. This game broke me. I never wanted to see another Spider-Man game released after this or even continue making YouTube videos because I had no confidence in any developer or publisher seeing what this character meant to me and so many other people like me, and instead would only see dollar signs. It sucked the passion right out of me. Having to play this game again for this review was emotionally and physically draining, and it took me an entire week to write this review because I just didn't want to go back to it. And there's a reason why I haven't touched this game since 2014. I am 12 pages in, 9,100 words in this freaking script typed out, which is arguably my longest review, but I can say, without a shadow of a doubt, for all it had to live up to, and everything it failed to be, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is the worst Spider-Man game of all time.